Hello and welcome to the third and final video of our Journeying Through Advent series. This week we're going to take a look at Matthew's Gospel, particularly chapter 2, as we move into looking at some of the major characters and major symbols such as the Magi and the star from Matthew's telling of Jesus' birth narrative here in this video session. Before we get into the scripture reading, which the scripture will be Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 through 12, and that is the Epiphany reading. Epiphany is, of course, the 6th of January, and then on the 8th, as we celebrate the baptism of Jesus, we'll also do the Epiphany gospel reading, and so you'll hear this reading on Sunday if you've listened to the video before January 8th. But before we get into the scripture, I'm going to cover a few things, major symbols and themes and different things about Matthew's gospel, especially relating to this particular narrative. Of course, this birth narrative of Jesus. Then we'll look at the scripture reading and talk about some of the major things there. So one major thing to note, beginning and starting off, is that Matthew's main motivation in writing his gospel is to explain the Christian mystery, the mystery of Christianity to these early communities. And his early community was made up of believers that are both Jewish and Gentile, and so Matthew is writing to this very unique group of individuals. Matthew's previous inclusion that Jesus is a son of Abraham, son of David, his inclusion of foreign women in the genealogy, they all point to that Jesus is destined as being for both the Gentiles and for the Jewish people. And this is a really important note, of course, as Matthew begins his gospel. That's an important thing. He's trying to weigh together these two, bring together these two groups of people, the Jewish people, the Gentile people. And as he writes his gospel, he makes a very intentional point to show how both groups are included in this in this story and in what Jesus lives and dies and is resurrected for. So the Christological moment, which is the moment kind of that Jesus is revealed as the Son of God in the gospel stories, that he's revealed as the Son of God, the Messiah. It was originally attached to the resurrection, and especially in early Christianity, of course, it was the moment of the resurrection. And that is that moment in which that is revealed. Jesus is the Son of God. Jesus is the Messiah. This resurrection, this defeating of death, and then it's moved to baptism. And in baptism, the enunciating that Jesus is the Son of God, Jesus is the Messiah. We see that in some of the Gospels as well. That's the moment of Jesus's annunciation. And then, of course, in Luke and Matthew, that's the only two Gospels we get this narrative of Jesus' birth. And so this conception begetting, the begetting of God's Son, this conception of the Christological moment, this conception of the revealing of Jesus as the Messiah, the Son of God, takes on it takes on some of those themes in the birth narrative here in Matthew. We see that in Luke as well. And so attaching that Christological moment, making sure that understanding of Jesus is revealed, is important in the way that Matthew tells this story. Now, after the resurrection of Jesus, of course, which is the moment that the Christological moment is typically attached to, there were, of course, people that proclaimed the good news, and there were those who listened that accepted it, those who paid homage to Jesus, and then there were others that rejected the message and the preachers. And after the baptism of Jesus, of course, Jesus goes forth proclaiming the good news, and in his doing so, some people accept it and others reject it. So there's this kind of twofold sequence, twofold sequence of reaction that occurs in Matthew's gospel. Often it's this Christological sequence. There's a revelation. There's a revelation that Jesus in the resurrection. There's a proclamation by the preachers, and then there's an accepting or a denial, a reaction from those who hear it. Some deny it, some pay homage. There is Jesus is baptized. He goes forth and proclaims the good news in his life. Some accept Jesus, and others reject him. This sequence, this Christological sequence of revelation, proclamation, and then a reaction that contains twofold: some that accept and some that reject. And that Matthew's reflecting very much so on the times around him. Of course, Jesus is rejected by the Pharisee authorities. They're hostile to his claims. The chief priests are hostile to Jesus, and there's early Christian preachers that are punished for bearing testimony. There's Matthew dealing with the things that are around him in the time of his writing. So understanding Matthew's context is very important. That the time that he's writing in, the people that he's writing to, the Jewish people, the Gentile people, his intention to them, his intention of his gospel in general, of this narrative, that explaining that Christian mystery, explaining the Christology of Jesus, the revealing Jesus as the Messiah, the Messiah who Scripture prophesies, that Scripture tells about, revealing that Jesus is the Son of God. There's a lot of intentionality in the things that Matthew is writing as he writes this narrative that we're about to read, but as he writes the gospel as a whole. Matthew's focus on the Christian mystery being revealed to those that read his gospel is at the top of the list of the things that Matthew is focusing on. And so moving to before we get to the scripture, a couple other things I just want to touch on is that um, there's 4 to 5 citations that are written in this kind of formula that we see in these first 2 chapters of Matthew that really highlight again his understanding, his knowledge of the Old Testament, and he applies these things to Jesus. He cites things like Micah 5:1, 2 Samuel 5:2. He does this in the first 6 verses of chapter 2. He joins the statement from Micah that there will be a ruler from Bethlehem with the one from 2 Samuel that speaks of a shepherd of God's people. That line was originally spoken to David about the people of Israel, and he attaches these things to Jesus. He evokes, of course, David's place of origin in Bethlehem, which then, that's where Jesus is born. That lineage to David is further, um, it was made stronger in these references that Matthew makes to Scripture. There's an implicit citation of Isaiah 60. This verse in Isaiah 60, verse 1, addresses Jerusalem, makes claims that the light and the glory of the Lord has risen in you. In these verses, he attaches them to this narrative of Jesus' birth. The Magi themselves also share some similarities to Balaam from Numbers 24. Of course, some people see that, others don't. Of course, scholars have differing opinions. But in that story, Balaam acknowledges the greatness of an Israelite ruler who is symbolized in a rising star. Of course, the rising star that we will see, but we all know well from the birth narrative of Jesus. The Magi, of course, seek this star. They bring gifts. Those gifts are also seem to be a reference to Isaiah 60, verses 5 through 6, that speaks of nations coming with wealth, that there will be gold and frankincense. And then there's a verse, Psalm 72 speaks of kings that will bring gifts and pay homage. So we will see throughout the birth narrative of Jesus, but also throughout Matthew's gospel, of course, his deep understanding of the Old Testament and his application of the Old Testament to Jesus. And on top of this, there's also seems to be evidence that a source, a pre-Matthean source, exists that Matthew may have used in conjunction with most of the narrative being from Matthew himself in writing this birth narrative. Now, there's a few ways that like a pre-tradition or source is plausible. A few ways that that's kind of tested, that there's criteria that scholars and things use. If there's peculiarities, things that seem odd in the writing from Matthew that don't seem to be in line with the other things and the way his vocab, his style, his organization, how he writes, and so on. If those things exist, then that might point to a tradition. If there's tension or conflict in a material where it seems that maybe 2 bodies of work may have been joined together, it seems that that the flow, the understanding, that even the details, different things, maybe the organization and the writing style, those things don't seem to mesh perfectly, might indicate that there's been a joining of 2 bodies of material into one. Other parallels in other material as well. So you have Luke's infancy narrative where there's some things that are shared, and of course Luke and Matthew write independent of one another. And so if there's these shared details that are consistent and that are together, then there might be evidence of a pre-tradition, and where the discrepancies between the two, the details that are different, maybe where there is a lack of information in the shared tradition. And so that explains both the discrepancies as well as the shared similarities. So of course parallels in other material, and so that's some of the criteria. Again, the determining what is Matthew, what isn't Matthew from the rest of the work is a very detailed academic work with lots of criteria and study. But there is maybe some evidence of a pre-tradition. Matthew in this unique gospel brings it together, arranges it in his own language, his own context, his own theological vision, shaping it in the final reading that we get, revealing to us something that is true, that is important, that is good news. So we'll move on from some of those things to the reading in chapter 2, verses 1 through 12, the Magi visiting the Messiah, the birth of Jesus in Matthew. And so I'll go ahead and read Matthew chapter 2, 1 through 12. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. When he had called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them where the Messiah was to be born. "In Bethlehem in Judea," they replied, "for this is what the prophet has written. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judea, are by no means the least among the rulers of Judea, for out of you will come a ruler who will be my shepherd, my people Israel." Then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me, so that I too may go and worship him." After they had heard the king, they went on their way, and the star they had seen when it rose went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother, Mary, and they bowed down and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route. So, of course, this is Matthew's version of the birth narrative. It gets combined with Luke's version. When we have our Christmas pageant, when we see Christmas pageants, we get the shepherds and the Magi and the star and all the things, but of course they aren't in both stories. This is Matthew's version. So the first thing that we'll talk about is, of course, one of the major characters in this story that's not in Luke's, the Magi. There are records of Magi of all different kinds: enchanters, fortune tellers, dream interpreters, astronomers, men of science, magicians, of course, so many different kinds. Matthew's Magi that are interpreting this rising of the star, that are following a star, seems to point to them as being some kind of astrologers. And the phrase "from the east" that we're presented with gives us a little bit of ambiguity about where the Magi are from. There's three uh, theories about where the Magi come. The most common one is that they're from Persia or Parthia. The term Magi was first associated with the Persians, with this region. There's early Christian art that depicts the Magi as Persian. A Zoroastrian background also points to this region as a possibility of the Magi's home. We know that astrology in this area was flourishing. There's lore of astrology, astral lore of this region that is applied to royal births, so on and so forth. This is probably the most common view. Babylon is another view because they also had a deep interest in astronomy and astrology as well. There was a large colony of Jewish people that remained there after exile, so astrologers could have learned of this Jewish messianic expectation from that colony. And there's also references in Daniel's description of the Babylonian court that reference Magi. The third one is that potentially from the Arab or Syrian desert, the gifts of myrrh, frankincense, of gold, they're associated with desert camel tribes that come in this region. And this area also was known for having a reputation of wisdom. So those are the three kind of main interpretations of the East, of where the Magi came from, with, of course, the first one being the most common. So a bit about the Magi. The Magi were wise and learned among the Gentiles. Matthew is again pointing and directing the Gentiles that are reading his gospel to their inclusion. He includes the Magi are the ones that will lead us in this story. They are wise. They receive the proclamation through nature, as we see in Romans chapter 1 and chapter 2, that the Gentiles receive things through nature, so they go to pay homage, but the full revelation to them can't come in nature. It's Scripture that reveals the fullest extent, the full secret, the special revelation, and that, of course, is given by God to the Jews. So there's this kind of paradox that Matthew might be presenting, that the Jews have scripture. They can learn from the prophets, see what the prophets have. But the Jewish leaders that are presented in these stories, very particular Jewish people, not all Jewish people, don't worship the newborn king. Of course, Herod is going to plan to wants to kill Jesus. He's afraid, and it seems like the other leaders are as well. And however, the wise men then are these Gentiles who accept the proclamation. They leave where they're from. They bring gifts. They come to pay homage. Um, and so there's this kind of paradox that they don't have the scriptures, but the fullness will be revealed to them. And those in the story that have the words of the prophets don't seem to pay um, full attention or want to pay homage to Jesus, but they are afraid. So Matthew isn't only reflecting again on his own times. Matthew's writing in a specific time. He's not only reflecting on the conversion of Gentiles and persecutions of Jewish leaders in his time, but he's also referencing the passion, the King of the Jews, that thing, that name and title that Jesus gets in the Passion. It's only used in the Passion and here. So there's definitely a connection, it seems, that Matthew's making intentionally to that title. Jesus is rejected by Herod here as the leaders reject Jesus at the Passion. Again, this isn't an anti-Semitic message from Matthew. It's one that speaks out against the chief priests, the Pharisees, these specific leaders that were persecuting believers, that spoke out and conspired against Jesus, refuted Jesus, those that made claims that the body of Jesus was stolen by the disciples. Those people are the ones that Matthew is criticizing, these certain people and their certain actions. He again is writing among and for Jewish people as well as Gentiles, but there's a large Jewish community. Matthew sees Jesus and his gospel as instructing the people who follow the Jewish tradition and the Torah in a continuation. He has great care and shows many interactions and a deep understanding of the Old Testament of that scripture. So moving on from kind of from the Magi, the next major symbol, the big thing of Matthew's story that is an important to our pageants and our reflections and our interpretation of the story is the star, the star that the Magi follow, the star that leads to Jesus. And Matthew's age would not have found it unusual that a star would herald the birth of Jesus. Reports of stars guiding towards great events were not uncommon. Even in Jewish belief, stars were signs of marking births or deaths, births or deaths of great men. That was accepted. Even with the doubts of historicity within this text, it's important to investigate, I think, the potential phenomenon at the time of Jesus' birth that would have maybe be seen as a star. Matthew is referencing and using the star, and that there's an importance behind that phenomenon. And even if the historicity isn't perfectly accurate, the remembrance of a phenomenon like whatever the star is that Matthew is referencing would have been important to Christian believers that came after. They would have had a remembrance, a connection to it. And so investigating some of the potential phenomena that this star could be, assuming it is not an actual star, and it most likely wasn't. One is that it could have been a supernova, an explosion of a distant star. There's dozens of those that are discovered each year. They create incredibly um, bright and visible light in the sky, but most of them are not discernible by the naked eye. And so that would make it, of course, maybe something that difficult that this may have been what Matthew, the event that Matthew is maybe referring to in record of a supernova at this time period of Jesus' birth doesn't seem to exist. It's a logical guess, but a guess all the same. And another potential theory is a comet. Comets move in regular elliptical orbits, of course, around the sun. When they're closest to the sun and to the earth, they create this striking bright appearance across the sky as they seem to have a tail as they move across, and very noticeable. Halley's Comet is known to have been around since about 240 BC, and it appeared in around 1211 BC, nearish the time, a few years before the date of Jesus. But it reconciles. But if one reconciles some of the historicity and issues in dating that is in Matthew's gospel with some of Matthew's theological purposes, it's possible a comet may have been the star that is being the reference phenomenon from this event. Origen writes that the star of the Magi was probably similar to a comet or a meteor. And then A third and probably the most interesting and maybe the most plausible theory is a planetary conjunction. So Jupiter and Saturn are in conjunction about every 20 years, where they um, are crossing the path perfectly of one another. So about every 20 years that happens with Jupiter and Saturn, and Mars makes a conjunction with these other two planets once every about 100 or 805 years. In 7 BC, about exactly on the time dating Jesus' birth, Saturn and Mars passed three times during, or sorry, Saturn and Jupiter passed three times during May and June, um, either during September and October, and then December. So those three times of the year, early, kind of that late spring, early summer, early fall, and then in December. And then Mars joins in the following year, creating that triple planetary conjunction. Mention of this is indicated in at least one work about stars and planetary movements that was written during the time period right before or after Jesus' birth. There's another written on planetary movement. There's another work written on planetary movement in 7 BC, right perfectly at this time. So there's written and dated and recorded um, works and reflections on these planetary movements. And there's also much written about zodiacal calculations that dates back 2000 BC and also during the post-Christian Judaism. However, there's little about this detailing at the time of Jesus' birth and during his life. But the event of the triple conjunction occurs, the one that would have occurred occurs in the Pisces constellation. And that constellation is associated with the last days and with the Hebrew people. Jupiter is associated with with Persian astrologers and with the coming of a world ruler. Saturn itself that is identified as a star of the Amorite people, the people that would have been in the region of Canaan would have been at this area. So there's speculative evidence that that could lead one to making a claim that there's a Parthian or a Persian astrologer who predicts that in Palestine, in this region associated with Jupiter, that in Palestine among the Hebrew people, a world ruler of the last days would be born. Although this particular theory, of course, is still speculation, its connection and its possibility and the way in which all these different things line up to make this a potential phenomenon that does have some intelligible sense to me is very fascinating, and it's interesting. And also our curiosity to investigate this phenomenon just through the words of this, that Matthew says, just this star, leads us to a deeper understanding and engagement with the context and with the people that Matthew's writing to, with the people of this time. It gives us a better understanding of them and the things that they may have fastened on to these signs, the revealing of the Messiah and to the Son of God. And so there's truths that can be gleaned through our investigation, through our curiosity, through our engagement with Scripture, and it gives us a better understanding of the people that Matthew is writing to, who would have been hearing this. The appearance of a star for the birth of the Messiah, Harold's attempt on the child's life, these motives would have been familiar. Believers would have connected with them. Matthew reveals something to the Gentiles, to the Jewish people in his community. He reveals something to all but read the gospel, reveals something to us about ourselves, about that audience and themselves, and reveals to us truth and revelation through these pages and beyond them, and through what he writes about God and about Jesus Christ, about the Messiah, about salvation, and about the story of the gospel, the good news. Now we'll move on to I'll put the reflection questions up. Feel free, of course, to reflect on these, to discuss them with those that you may have around you if you feel called to do that. And I just want to thank everyone that tuned in and watched the video or joined us for this video, or for any of the others, or for all of them, anybody that joined us in this online presentation of our Journeying Through Advent series. Thank you again for joining us.